This video is the first in a series that will be teaching you how to bend strings on guitar, and this video will contain the first 5 lessons. So let's talk about some good rules of thumb to do when you're bending. So you have your top 3 strings being the G, B, and E. And when you bend the G, B, and E, you're going to push them up towards the ceiling. The low strings, or your bottom 3, you have the D, A, and low E. You're going to pull these down towards the ground. So bend the top 3 up and bend the bottom 3 down. Now you can definitely do pull the bend or pull the G string down when you bend it. However, when we get to some of the more advanced type of bend ideas, you will be putting that G string in the way of some of the other strings we'll be using. So it's just a good habit to start bending the G string up instead of pulling it down. Now, the other thing is, you typically want to bend with 3 fingers. So that means, let's say if you're going to bend the 10th fret on the high E, that means your ring finger would be sitting on the 10th fret, and basically your middle finger will be sitting on 9, and your first finger will be sitting on 8. So this way, when you bend, you're going to be pushing the string up with 3 fingers instead of 1. The reason why is because you have more control over your bend, and you also have more power in the bend. It is possible to do some bends with 1 finger, and some riffs will require you to use only 1 finger. But most of the time, you want to try and use 3 fingers as much as possible. So, you can use the pinky on bends. However, a lot of bend riffs will have you'll have a very difficult time playing them if you start with the pinky on a bend. So that's another reason why having your ring finger down first will actually help you with a lot of the bend riffs that are out there, and a lot of the ones we're going to go over. So let's take a look at the first example. So what you see on the screen right now is you have a note in one bar. The next bar is the same note, but you are bending up to that note that you just played. You know when a bend is supposed to happen because of the arrow that follows the note. Above these arrows in the first example is the word full, which means a full step, which also is the same as a whole step. A lot of tabs will have the number 1 written above it when it's supposed to be a full step. It's all the same thing. So the number 1, the word full, or the word whole all mean the same thing. You're going to bend up a whole step. Now, a whole step on guitar is basically 2 frets apart. So if I'm on 10 here, if I want to go up a whole step, I add 2. So 10 plus 2 is 12. So that's going up from 10 to 12. That's a whole step. Let's say I'm on the 8th fret and I want to go down a whole step. Well, that's going from 8 down to 6. So 8 subtract 2 is 6. So 8 down a whole step is the 6th fret. So first bend exercise we're going to do, everything's a whole step bend. So what you do is you pick the first note, and then the next bar, the goal is to pick the 10 and then bend it up into the note you just played. Now, it's very important that you bend slow enough so you actually hear the note go up to the appropriate pitch. The reason why is because, especially when you're starting out, your ears are being trained to hear what sounds correct. There's also not a lot of muscle memory involved with bending strings to the appropriate pitch, because every string on every fret requires a different amount of tension to bend the note to the proper pitch you're attempting to play. So that's why it's very important. Bend fairly slow when you are learning how to bend, so this way you give your ear a chance to hear the note that you're reaching for. All right, let's check out the first example. So notice I used 3 fingers the whole time I was doing it, so I'd hit the 12, and I shift my hand over, so this my ring finger is on the 10 when I'm bending. Now, another thing to keep in mind is when you are bending, you're pushing other strings out of the way. For example, when I bend this low E, watch what happens to the A string and the D string. Can't really see the D string move much, but the A string, see how that gets bent too? That's what's going to happen, is you're going to be pushing and pulling the adjacent strings along with you. Now you may have noticed, especially if you have distortion on, some unwanted noise while doing some of these bends, especially on the higher strings. Because what happens is when you push other strings out of the way, if you're not muting anything with the right hand, that's what's going to happen when you come back down, because the strings will start to vibrate after you've let go of them. So the way to prevent that from happening, to prevent the unwanted noise, is you have to take your right hand, take the palm, and put them on the strings that you're not playing. So if you're bending the G string, you should have your palm touching the E, A, and D strings. Same thing when you go to the B string to bend it. You're going to have to adjust where your hand is to make sure that G string is muted. Same thing with the high E. You got to adjust your hand so it's covering now the B string as well. It's not as important on these strings at the bottom, because if you do it properly, like right now my index finger is touching the adjacent string a little bit. In fact, so is my ring and my middle. So that will take care of muting here on when you're bending the lower strings. So you do want to practice with your fingers on the tips, but they're not completely flat. They're just slightly flat enough, so this way they're gently touching the adjacent string. So it is very important that you mute out the unplayed strings when you bend. This way you don't have a bunch of unwanted noise. This next exercise is similar to the first one. We have 3 notes to start. The next bar or measure will have the same 3 notes, but you will be bending the first note. So you're basically trying to replicate the same 3 notes again, but you're just bending the first one. Also important to take notice of the half written above the arrow this time. Half means a half step bend. So, for example, since we're bending the 7th fret up a half step, you basically add 1 or subtract 1 when you're going to use a whole step distance. So this means if you're going to go from 7 up a whole step, you go from 7 to 8. If you're on 5 and you want to go down a whole step, we go down from 5 to 4. So a whole step apart is 2 frets. A half step apart is only 1 fret. So let's check out this next exercise. free to go back and forth between the notes where you hear the note you're supposed to bend to and then practice bending up to it. So even like the first example, if you need to hit that 12 a few times and then bend it and pick that bent note just to make sure it sounds the same, that's fine. It doesn't have to be followed like 100% the way it's written out, especially that first exercise, because the idea is to train your ear to hear the notes you're bending up to. So like with the last one that we just did, if you need to just practice going between that note and then bending up into it, that's fine. And then once you get comfortable with that, then you can start incorporating the whole thing the way it's written, so it's a bit more musical there. And it is a bit more challenging when you don't stop and try and check the note back and forth. Okay, so the next example is pretty much the same idea. You got 3 notes, and then the next bar you have the same 3 notes, but you're bending the string on the first one, on the first note I mean. Now we're bending up a whole step again. This next exercise will have you going between not hearing the bend come down and then doing a bend release. So if you look at the second bar, you'll see that the arrow goes up and then comes back down. And when the arrow comes back down, it comes to a note that's in parentheses. This means that you'll hear the note come back, but you don't pick it. So, some things to help you out as far as making sure that you don't hear a bend come down. What I do, there's basically two different things you can do. So after you've bent like the 15 for this example, if you come back down fast enough and then pick at the same time, so it's kind of like timing, letting go, and picking at the same time. If you don't pick at the same time, this will happen. So there, you should have been able to hear the bend come down. It's like dum dum versus the ba bum bum bum. That just takes practice on getting the timing down. So this way you're having the bend come down and pick it at the same time, so you actually don't hear it come down. The other thing I do, if I'm playing something really slow, I use my right hand to mute the string. So what you can do is after you bend it, the right hand will just come down and touch the string that you have bent, and it should stop the sound. So that's another technique you can do. So just 2 ideas that I use in order to stop the string from ringing out when I want to not hear the bend come down. Now, as far as the bend release goes, you need to keep pressure on the string you're bending in order to hear the note continue to ring out. So if you don't keep pressure on the string, what will happen is something like this. So it doesn't ring out anymore. You might get some funky noises. So what a lot of guitar players do when they first try and learn to bend and have the release is they'll like let go of it and then try and put the pressure down after the release, but it doesn't work that way. You have to maintain the same amount of pressure when you go up and come back down. So you have to have your finger pressing into the string and the fretboard when you do the release. So this way you hear the note continue to ring out. Okay, let's check out the next example. Last example we'll go over in this video is going to have a bit of a delay before you bend the string. So in this example up on the screen right now, when I do handwritten tab, what I'll do to show this is I'll have the arrow drawn going over first or going out then up to indicate that you're going to pick that note, wait a moment, and then you bend it. So you may also see this in professionally done tabs as well. The tab program that I use to write out all this stuff didn't have that feature, so that's why you'll see the 10th fret, then you'll see the 10th fret again in parentheses, the bend goes up, comes back down, so you have the release, and then you have the 8th fret next. So instead of bending the string right away, you're going to pick the note, wait till the next beat, then bend it up, release on the next beat, and then the final note on the 4th beat there. So, sounds something like this. It's important to take notice of how high each of those bends is supposed to go, because the first half of the bends are a full step, the last half is a half step. So it is important when you're reading tablature that you pay attention to how far you're supposed to bend the string. Sometimes you may see 3/4 bends, which is very rare. More likely you'll see a 1/4, so like a 1/4 step bend, which is in between the notes that you pick and a half step. So it's like a really subtle bend, super subtle. You basically just kind of nudge the string. Now another one that you might come across is a 1.5 steps. So you might see 1.5 written above the arrow, which is a pretty high bend. You may see 1 3/4. You may even see 2. If you see a 2 written above, that means a 2 whole step bend. So basically that's like 4 frets higher. That is not very common. 1.5 is kind of common. It's not much. Not too many people bend that high all the time, because in my experience, when you start bending higher than a whole step, you start running the risk of breaking strings. I've busted plenty of strings getting a bit carried away with bending during some improv sessions. So you can break strings during bends, but it's very unlikely you're going to break a string just doing half steps and whole steps, unless maybe you have an old string and it's ready to go anyway. So that's the end of this video lesson. If you have any questions about what I went over in this, please send me an email. I'll be happy to answer your questions. And thank you for watching.